Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this special lecture on the genre of the essay by Professor Christi Merrill. I'm very, very thankful to Professor Merrill for joining us for this lecture on what also happens to be Hindi Divas today. So I did want to make a note of that as well. Professor Merrill is a professor of South Asian literature and post-colonial theory, jointly appointed in the departments of Asian languages and cultures and comparative literature, where she has been a key part of efforts to establish an interdepartmental program in critical translation studies at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Her translations of the oral-based stories of the Rajasthani writer Vijaydan Retha, Chuboli and Other Stories, supported by an NEA Literature Fellowship, were co-published by Katha and Fordham University Press, and won the 2012 A.K. Ramanujan Award for translation from the Association of Asian Studies. She spent the 2013 and 14 school year in India on an NEH AIIS Senior Fellowship, researching her current book project, Genres of Real Life, Mediating Stories of Injustice Across Languages, and translating the life story of the Dalit activist Kaushalya Besantri from Hindi. Her articles on human rights and literature in translation have appeared in South Asia, Testimony Between History and Memory, Memory and Genocide, On What Remains and the Possibility of Representation, Blackwell's Companion to Translation Studies, Boundary 2, and World Literature Today. Thank you again, Professor Merrill, and over to you.
Thank you so much, especially to you, Sanchit, and to you, Rita. I really appreciate this opportunity. Just a few words of warning. I have glaucoma. I have low vision, and so sometimes I can't see what's going on. So if you see that something might be happening that I can't see, please do unmute and just let me know. And also just a word that this is work that I've been researching for years and trying to write about. It's a complex nest of issues, but because of my glaucoma, I can't really read from scripted talk, and I also can't really even read the slides. What I decided to do today is give you some of the examples that you can look at and think about as I give the overview, but I've got a kind of script in my head, and I can kind of see what the slides are, but I just can't read closely, which is kind of ironic because I'm going to be talking about close reading. So this project, as Sanjit just was explaining, draws on some of my experiences translating the work of an anti-caste feminist writer named Kaushalya Besantri that grew up in Nagpur, speaking in dialects of Marathi and then learning standard Marathi. And then she also learned English and standard Hindi, and decided years later, for all kinds of complicated reasons, that she was going to write something about write her own life story. She decided to write in Hindi because it was the national language. And it raised a lot of very interesting questions that were interesting to me as someone who has an MFA in translation and an MFA in nonfiction writing. I did those degrees while I was also doing a PhD in comparative literature at University of Iowa. And this project is kind of bringing together all three degrees. And I'm thinking a lot about artistry. When I started off, I was thinking a lot about whether we should read something like Dohra Bishop as a literary work, whether this would be considered literary nonfiction. And that was one of the phrases used to describe the difference between a style of nonfiction writing that plays with some of our generic expectations that you're going to get an unmediated, realistic representation of details of a life story, and instead uses literary technique to kind of question that. So there's on the left, I'm taking from a publication in Words Without Borders that appeared in October 2018 of an excerpt of, I think it's the 8th chapter of Dohra Bishop that I'm translating as Doubly Cursed. In it, she throws back the taunts that she used to get as an untouchable, Mahar, and all those words are used in her writing. riding her bicycle to school and being kind of too progressive and moving up in class. And she gets taunted by all numbers of people. And I really like the way she throws those taunts back at them. And at one point they ask, how's this Harijan Bai? You know, she's the daughter of a beggar, and here she is riding her bike to college. And my reading of that is that she actually takes that taunt of Harijan Bai and she makes fun of it, makes fun of the lack of awareness of how patronizing a term like Harijan is, how it's gendered. And also in those early chapters, I think about that false equivalence we make between untouchable, Mahar, Harijan, Dalit. In much of the Dalit writing that I've been reading, there's a real emphasis on Dalit as someone who has come into a consciousness about the ways that they are treated as and read through caste. And I'm using that idea of coming into consciousness to ask questions about our own ways of reading. One of the arguments I'm trying to make is that a term like literary has its own set of hierarchies. And the question that I was asking when I started this project about whether her work invites a literary reading is kind of asking the question the wrong way. What I'm trying to do now is think about what a literary reading of nonfiction might enable in terms of these larger questions that are being asked. One of the works that I can't read in Marathi, I don't read Marathi, but I've read in translation, I'm very interested in, is Kumar Baude's Antaspot. And when I first started reading the excerpts that have been translated, I got very interested in the way she uses that word as a way of thinking about genres of nonfiction. And she calls into question the way we read autobiography. And I get into that in later chapters. I'm not going to be focusing very much on that today. It kind of comes in ancillary ways. And if we have time, I'll try to say more about this in the Q&A. But one of the things that's very interesting to me is the way that different language hierarchies come into play, including her excerpt that from Antaspot that was published in Poison Bread, a volume about Dalit writing and the importance of it as a critical intervention. And she talks to Sharmila Rege about her own writing as critical narrative. And I'm very interested specifically in that idea of the literary as critical and asking us to have a critical interpretive edge that we bring to our writing, and have that moment that I read about years ago in Sanskrit class. You know, she's a Sanskrit professor as well as a writer, where you have a moment of sphota, of kind of recognition. And I think that her writing does that for me and requires a literary reading that thinks in broader ways about these connections between our very personal experience, doing a close reading of specific passages across languages, and the broader questions we're asking. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, especially as I do more and more work with digital humanities, is the kind of big questions that get employed and that come to bear on our close readings. And one of the things that Franco Moretti has argued is that by focusing so much on close reading, we assume that sort of that same literary value I was talking about before. We select a few examples that we think rise up to that level. And I actually think that hides some of the infrastructures and the institutions of reading that we're relying on. And it's those that I'm calling to question. So today I'm actually picking a big range of disparate examples that I talk about in two of the chapters, one that I've written and one that I'm still in the midst of writing. And those are the ones I'm going to talk about today, thinking about how the close reading little picture relates to the big picture. I'm using my hands. I hope I'm not making lots of sounds in the microphone. The title of this talk is actually taken from the title of the chapter on Montaigne, and draws very much on the things I learned as a nonfiction in the nonfiction writing program. One of the things that really intrigued me, we regularly read Montaigne's essay in the Donald Frame translation from, I think, 1958. And there was an emphasis on in my program that we were not really availing ourselves fully of all the literary techniques that the essay makes possible if we followed the tradition of Francis Bacon. Instead, they really pushed us to think about Montaigne and his ways of reading the essay, especially the one that really struck me was his essay of the cannibals. It seemed to me that he was poised in this moment. He's considered the first modern French writer. He grew up speaking Latin because his father wanted him to speak a language that was worldly and authoritative, and he rejected that and wanted to write in the spoken language, and began writing what he called essays because he was attempting to do something new. And it was that new thing he was doing that I got very interested in and started connecting with the work I was doing in my PhD in comparative literature, critiquing colonial studies. And so one of the passages that really drew my, kind of caught me up was the Frame translation. And I know some French, so I went in and I started looking back at the Florio translation that my classmates in the writing program were having trouble reading. And also I went and looked at kind of modern textbooks that modernize his French. And then I looked at his writing. And it's really interesting to look at him because he does quote widely in Latin, and he really is calling into question some of the language hierarchies that are kind of implicit in the time he lived, but he's also really taking seriously this idea of conquest and the relationship with the other in the new world. And he's thinking a lot about what it means to be civilized or a barbarian. And I think of it as kind of a revolutionary perspective on your own place in the world. As I said before, I'm kind of trying to think about big picture questions. And one of the things that I think he was essaying in the sense of attempting was to call into question the superiority of Europeans such as himself and the way he was getting trained to take a superior attitude to the people that were being introduced through explorations in the 17th century. One of the critiques that I especially liked was actually a book that Rita introduced me to many years ago. I ended up being at Cornell with Eric Cheyfitz. His reading of Montaigne has really influenced the way I'm thinking about this. He really sees in Montaigne a broader critique of that superiority and the assumptions of what is proper. It's a book that I keep coming back to, and I think my students also have really found it to be helpful. It's especially helpful in thinking about a term like cannibalism, which in Eric Cheyfitz's work, he starts to complicate and after Montaigne and argues that Montaigne is going beyond the sort of sensational understanding of what cannibalism is, but really trying to read people in their own terms. And he looks specifically at the Tempest and the way that the figure of the Caliban comes in. There's been a lot written about the Tempest that I think is really worth thinking about in terms of post-colonial studies and those critiques that are implicit and ways of reading into it. One of the things that I think I haven't seen many people besides Cheyfitz in Poetics of Imperialism think about is the ways that critique was part of the writing in different literary genres, and I would call the essay a literary genre in this case. So one of the places that I see that taking place very much is in a chapter from an old book that's looking at Florio's translation and how much it ended up impacting systems of thought in the time. And at what point Matheson goes through and does a comparison and thinks about how the New World appears in the essay of the cannibals, and how much Shakespeare is kind of inspired by that, plagiarizes it if you're gonna if you go that route. But I think of it more as offering a critique that's really important. And he's the one who really helped me understand the historical moment where the essay as a form gets translated into English and Latin, written by Francis Bacon, who does something very different with it. So in my writing program, we were told that in high school, I think this is how, from what I understand, this is also the way English education in India works. In America, we're very much taught to write in the tradition of Francis Bacon. And in America, it's a 5-paragraph essay. You have a thesis statement, you have an argument that at the end of the first paragraph, you marshal your evidence, and you're making one single, very straightforward argument. In Montaigne's work, he does something a lot more complicated, and he's questioning his own positionality, which is something that in the 90s when I was in graduate school and in the 80s when I was an undergraduate was beginning to be the thing we were taught to do, but we were still told to write in the ways that Francis Bacon wrote. So there was a lovely, really wonderful, another wonderful book that came out in the late 90s that has been really helped me thinking about these ways that the subject is formed in the tradition of the essay and other kind of nonfiction writing by Hassan Melehy. And he's thinking about the cogito, as you can tell from the title of the book. And instead of the certainty and the authority that you have in the sort of Cartesian I in the cogito, he makes an argument for looking again at Montaigne for a much more complex understanding of our own authority in the I. And this is the one place where I lifted a paragraph, or not even a full paragraph, I think, from the chapter of my book where I'm discussing this. And I'm really interested in this idea of mastery and how the essay ends up training us to write a colonial form of the essay with all that authority. So the big picture is all of these things are going on with conquest and colonization. And then in individual classrooms, students are taught to write in this way that assumes that kind of authority and kind of quashes that skepticism that I think Melehy has some really, and between putting together Melehy and Cheyfitz, they get at something that Montaigne is doing in his essay that I think is really important to revisit and think about it, maybe as a recognition of some of the dangers of that superiority. I see. I'm going to go back one bit. I think in one of these slides, I can't remember now. I think it's Melehy talks about the importance of a kind of equivocal voice, but it could have been the Cheyfitz slide. And I've been thinking a lot about what it means to be equivocal. A lot of times that is seen as a bad thing where you're sort of mamby-pamby, you're not taking a strong stand. But I've been trying to think about it in terms of working towards equity and letting there be multiple voices, having multiple perspectives. One of the things that I've been puzzling over is how an essay by Said, he published a version of his Orientalism book as an essay in a literary journal in 1977, the Georgia Review. And it is not essayistic in the way that I was taught to write at University of Iowa. And I kind of puzzle over that, because I don't think that at that time he probably could have made the kind of, I would say, sphota, the kind of the ways that the structures of Orientalism came crashing down with his critique. And yet his critique is very much of the sort of style of Bacon. It takes on the powers in place and flips them. And one of my worries is whether, as one of the scholars who was an undergraduate and then a graduate student reading Said's work, if we need to complicate and try to make more equivocal the ways that we write the essay, in order to really do the work of the next generations in calling these into question. So the way he calls into question the rhetoric of the Orientalist scholar, I think we need to turn back on ourselves and against him and think about another way of writing that isn't so adversarial and kind of binaristic. And so one of the ways that I started calling this to question, I was interested, the first version of this book was, I was going to compare, and I'll tell you in a minute why I'm speaking in the past tense. I wanted to compare the way that the essay was taught in the French colonies and in the English colonies. And I wanted to find a specific example, and it just really made me wonder how French colonial officials could teach an essay like Of the Cannibals, which is considered, it's in a lot of literary texts. It's on prelim lists for French literature because it's one of the first, right up there with Dante and Cervantes as one of the first European authors to write in their own language and not in Latin. And yet it has such a critique of the colonial structure. I wondered, how could it be taught in the French colonies? So I got a grant to go to Aix-en-Provence and look at the colonial archive there. And what did I discover? It was not at all, no Montaigne. I could not find any textbook where Montaigne was taught. Instead, there were French translations of Kipling and Macaulay in their essays. And so that's the end of my first chapter that I've already written. And now I'm going to start talking about Macaulay and this idea of what the instrument, kind of colonial instrument, the essay is in, and its potential for doing something more complicated if we go back and look at some of the things that Montaigne is doing. So one of the things I did find was a composition d'écriture by a student in West Africa in the 1920s. And he's very declarative in exactly the way that if you read Said's saying, this is one of the things that is a signal of that authoritative superior view, considers itself civilized. This is the subject position, speaking in an abstraction as if things are very clear, right and wrong, no nuance, no complexity. And I just thought, I wonder if it's possible to teach the essay in a way that has more complexity and nuance. And so one of the things I'm doing in this chapter, I realized soon into this project that it was a much more complicated question than I set out to ask in the beginning. I'm going to have one chapter where I talk about this, and then I'm going to make a decision whether I really have it in me to do the research, or if it might be better for people who really know French better than I do and can really do justice to this research to kind of carry on with some of the ideas I have. So I don't have a comprehensive view of this, but it seems like it's there's some big questions that I'm asking that are sort of shaking some of the foundations of topics that I have learned in all my years of schooling. one of those is Macaulay. So I'm focusing in this chapter on Macaulay because I first started reading Minute on Indian Education in excerpted form in the Post-Colonial Studies reader. And he was just so easy to hate. And I still pretty much do. He's got, and so in 1835, he made a very persuasive case that we're not going to teach, I'm speaking now, he's addressing Parliament, thinking about, as many of you here already know, which languages are going to be taught in the subcontinent. And he asks, what language shall that be? And he has this famous case where he's kind of, again, thinking about these hierarchies, and he's saying, English is so much better. They're wasting their time trying to study Sanskrit and Arabic. And he's going along with Jones's idea that the Muslims should be reading Arabic and the Hindus should be reading Sanskrit. And it's very cut and dried. And there are all these binaries and hierarchies that we just are built into the systems of knowledge that we all learn. And there's not an easy way of calling them into question. And I teach this minute in a lot of my classes, and I have the students kind of think about what things they agree with and what they don't, and what shows up in a classroom. And especially, this was an especially helpful exercise in a class I taught last winter for undergraduates called Language Justice in South Asia. And I asked them to put together what they see here with what's going on in the language classroom today as we try to decolonize that. One of the things that I especially got interested in this minute is this idea of a class of interpreters. And one of the questions I'm trying to ask is, what kind of children, we talk about Macaulay's children and grandchildren, and I'm looking at Phule, who wrote some very interesting things in the late 19th century in English, being an interpreter for the British. And I'm also interested in his notion of what interpretation means, which I see here is very top down. He's assuming that these interpreters are going to be mouthpieces. And it's all the things, as a translation studies scholar, I want to push against. And I'm trying to do that in this chapter with this particular, with these particular essays, including one that he writes about slavery in the West Indies. It's a book review that appeared 10 years before the Minute on Indian Education. And Sanjit, I'm just going to ask how we're doing on time. We're good? I'm going to go about 15 more minutes. Does that sound great?
Yes, please.
Because I can speed up or slow down depending on what, yeah. And so, like I said, I do not have a comprehensive view of this, but I have little breadcrumbs that I'm following. And this is one of the close readings, the breadcrumbs that I'm really interested in, because it seemed to me, and I'm going to start kind of trying to do a little bit more work pairing up the things that were appearing in the Edinburgh Review, and then a few decades later, what ends up getting published in the French colonial textbooks. It seemed to me that there are a lot of things getting published in French in the Edinburgh Review. And I'm especially interested in the specific rhetorical stance that Macaulay takes towards slavery. He's very against slavery. He makes a very strong argument that the enslaved do not have rights, and a lot of the things are things I agree with. So here is the person for decades that I've really despised, and he stands as exactly the kind of character that I will disagree with at every turn. But here I actually am finding myself agreeing with him in this Edinburgh Review piece, where he's kind of thinking in broad terms about slavery and comparisons across different systems. And what's interesting to me is how much he uses that same really persuasive rhetoric, and it makes me laugh out loud in places. The way that the scene I talked about with Kausalya Baseline 3, when she's talking about the taunts, make me laugh out loud. It's quite courageous writing. It's persuasive. He's very much taking a superior stance to the colonizers, who are enslaving people and looking at that institution. So one of the things that he ends up doing is having he mounts a critique of that system that, again, I agree with. And I want to use this to ask about the kind of interpretation of the system of slavery and the different perspectives that he takes. I think he's actually very patronizing towards the colonizers. And I think it makes a much more complicated portrait in the ways that, starting with the post-colonial studies group, I was talking about that reader, the same group wrote The Empire Writes Back, and had a very binaristic way of thinking about colonizer and colonized, and just assumed that if you're in North America, if you're in Australia, if you're in Canada, that all of us are also colonized, or it wasn't really taking into account some of the really important questions that have been asked more recently about settler colonialism and the complicated roles that we all play. And it's not as easy as just assuming that all white people are thinking this way and all Black people are in this position, but he's making an argument that all Black people are being read the same way. At a certain point in this essay, he's saying, if you don't have your manumission papers, then you could get arrested. Doesn't matter if you're free. That's the way the laws work. And he's really taking issue with the ways the laws work. The thing that I'm more interested in is the complexities here and the ways he's using a very Baconian kind of style of argument to sort of divide up the people in, we'll say, located in Great Britain, and the people in Canada or North America, in Haiti, in Jamaica. He gets more specific, and I think that complexity that he is bringing in here begins to do some of the medium distant questioning that I think we need to connect with the moral and intellectual questions that he's raising here. I'm trying to compare that and this idea of class of interpreters with, in a kind of unusual move perhaps, Dwivedi, who is, as any of you who are students of the history of Hindi and Urdu and what people call the partition of Hindi and Urdu, he was really very instrumental in setting up a lot of infrastructures of Hindi literature and really kind of Brahmanizing it. And one of the things that's very interesting here is he has, I went and I did archival research at the Nagari Pracharani Samsthan in Benares. And I found this article on Abraham Lincoln, where he really sees him as an avatar of Vishnu. And he's talking about slavery in this way that assumes all Indian people as colonized and doesn't get at some of those complexities that I think need to be brought in. And so I kind of spent some time in the chapter looking at what's going on in the Hindi. So these are my kind of rough translations. I give an overall kind of summary of what he's talking about. He takes also, very much like Macaulay, a very wry look at the system of slavery in the United States, and does see it in black and white terms, and by that I mean it's a racial metaphor, and then uses pretty alarming language in Hindi to make those arguments. And he, like Macaulay, is asking about that assumption that if you are Black, then you are born to be enslaved. And one of the things that I'm kind of using in this chapter is the really wonderful work on examining the work of translators in the abolitionist movement. And one of the things they point out that there's an attention to words that are used for the enslaved and the racialized terms that denote your politics. And one of the things I'm trying to think through in all these chapters are the comparisons that are often made between the caste system in India and racism and its legacies of slavery in the United States, and where those comparisons are helpful and where they're not, and where they need to be complicated. One of my kind of working tenets is that we oftentimes are doing close readings of situations, and their specific terminology that convey what our critique is, what our alliances are, and that we need to find a way to bring those critiques into our readings more of the genres that we're using to discuss these, including things like the essay. So if we use that when we go back and do a comparison, or you do a close reading in Hindi of the way he's using that, he seems self-conscious about issues of caste and varna, and he seems kind of aware of the difficulties of this. And yet, as many of you know from this history, this is the time when Hindi speakers and Hindus are being pushed to mobilize under broad categories as majority, and to try to ignore some of those distinctions and those hierarchies that are taking place around caste and also between languages. One of the things that I just love, it would take me really a long time to try to find a overt connection, but I can't imagine that a Marathi speaker and reader like Dwivedi wouldn't be aware of Phule's critique. He does something equally cheeky, but I think what he does is he brings in the foreign reader and offers a connection between systems of enslavement and some of the hierarchies around race and caste that are happening, and makes those comparisons that someone like Dwivedi finds inconvenient, really points them out. So just the fact that we are reading this, I don't read Marathi, I've read this in the Hindi translation, which, by the way, doesn't have this dedication on the left, is especially as a US citizen, I'm just very grateful and also entertained by his very sardonic dedication, pulling me in as an American reader and kind of pushing me to say, don't go with the status quo, call into question some of these hierarchies that maybe you're taking advantage of without even thinking about them. And it to me goes back to something that also kind of took me, struck me early on when I started doing this work, was from the plea to a foreigner by Dr. Ambedkar. And he's saying that we need to call into question whose freedom is being talked about by whom. One of the things I argue is that there are generations of writers who have been empowered by this work, and there are systems of allyship that have been going on with translators who are positioned in all different ways. There's something that has been going on in the Ambedkarite movement that mobilizes these critiques and makes that idea being critical, both in the sense of something being really crucial, but also in bringing in a kind of reading strategy that's not complacent. I see that really that kind of critical narrative that is in, say, Paude's work, that's in Kausalya Besantari's, and is in many of the writers that I've studied here, really is attractive politically, ethically, intellectually, and emotionally. And that's that sort of critical edge that I'm particularly interested in bringing to bear in these literary close readings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Merrill, for that insightful and persuasive presentation, taking us through the varying rhetorics in literary history from French to English to Hindi. We'll now be open for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and you can ask it directly, or you can type it in the chat box. Perhaps I could get started, Professor.
Thank you.
I was thinking that the autobiography is often read by scholars as a critical narrative itself. So, what does the distinction of calling it a critical narrative in the first place and not an autobiography by the author themselves bring in?
That's a great question. I'll answer that with sort of two different pieces of writing that have been really persuasive to me. One is by Joan Scott. She's got an essay and then a book after that called The Evidence of Experience. And the idea that your experience is she critiques the idea that one's experience and therefore positionality automatically invites you to be read in a certain way. And I pair that with what I think about as an essentialist or a reductive reading. So the assumption that Kausalya Besantri, for example, because she and Kumud Paure object to being doubly cursed, but in an agential way rather than as victims. So oftentimes, especially with Dalit narratives, it's read as victim narratives. And I have kind of later on, I have a whole discussion of a critique of this idea of a victim. So first is Joan Scott, Evidence of Experience. And then there's I'm trying to, let's see if I can say this very succinctly. I was very interested in Rigoberta, the debates about Rigoberta Menchú and her testimonio and what Rigoberta Menchú did for the causes that she was working for. And so that was the kind of second really important piece of writing, all the debates around how she's read. And so I kind of start the book asking if there's a way of reading writers like Kausalya Besantri, Urmila Pawar is someone else I write about, Kumud Paure, Baby Kamble, and is there a way to read them not in essentializing terms? And so the autobiography is we often assume with essay, autobiography, a lot of these nonfiction genres, not only that we know how to read nonfiction in a very straightforward way, like the genre, but we also know how to read the person. And we kind of take their biographical details and read them in a really straightforward way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that certainly does.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Professor Merrill. Really enjoyed it. I was just thinking about what you said about the speaking in abstractions as a kind of attribute of the genre of the essay as it has descended from Bacon in particular. And I was thinking about like the kind of mode of address towards audiences and this dialectic between framing things in abstraction on the one hand, but also some of the examples we saw do address specific readers, right? Like Phule, although the book is written for a bigger audience, the address to the British or the American abolitionists, it has such a specific impact on how his text is read later. So just wanted to hear more about this relationship between the imagination of an audience and whether it's universal typically, or whether these specific kind of readerships are also there at one end of the spectrum and abstract formulations on the other end.
I love your question. And I just want to make sure I tell the people who've been in my classes, I did not set you up to this. I think that is a really key part. I think one of the reasons I was talking about the abstraction in that one place is because that example really warranted it. But I really like the connection that you're making, and I want to think more about it. I found I was taught growing up not to use I at all. And then in my MFA program, I was taught to use I, but to use it with very self-consciously. And I really like that idea of self-consciousness, because I think it relates to the kind of coming into consciousness that a lot of feminists and Dalit activists or anti-caste activists talk about. And I think that you're right, that the modes of address are really important. One of the writers and theorists that I really like is Noke Sakai in Translation and Subjectivity. He talks about heterolingual address, and he thinks a lot about the politics of address in exactly that way. So much so that I've reorganized the different essays in my book that I'm writing. So the first set is more about the I, the second part is more about the you, and the third part is more about in the third person. And it seems like a lot of the old school essayists spend a lot of time talking about they do this, and we're trained that way. But I think if you don't use the I in a self-conscious way, you end up not really knowing how you think about things, how you're implicated. You don't kind of knit together your perspective. You don't have that moment of self-consciousness that I think critical thinking and critical writing requires. Is that kind of what where your hunches were leading you? Okay.
They ask, how can the principle of slavery and racism be connected with the time of Dwivedi?
I was doing that specifically because 1909, he's celebrating Lincoln's centenary. And so he's really doing that to kind of drum up interest in a kind of anti-colonial movement. And this is around the same time, I think Ambedkar is in the US at that point, or has just gotten back, and he's finding that he's making a lot of comparisons between what's going on with the generation that has recently freed slaves, and kind of noticing what's going on in the US and what's going on in India, and the ways that so many of the people he's working with, most famously Gandhi, and the way he spars with him, and what Gandhi has done to the Untouchables, and Gandhi and the doom of the Untouchables and things like that. His critiques are very unflinching, and so the argument I'm making is that part of this hierarchy that we've inherited, when you have masters and slaves, colonizer, colonized, you kind of put those together, and you just assume that the victim, i.e. enslaved, the system's going to switch and the victim can be on top. That's what the kind of the anti-colonial movement suggests. Phule's critique in 1873, Ambedkar's critique in those early decades, is asking us to have a more complex hierarchy there. And it's not just, and so what I'm worried about is that just kind of trying to switch the hierarchy, you don't really change the system. You just change who's on top. And that's my problem with Dwivedi. And I see it having implications throughout America, including the pushback, for those of you who know, against critical race theory, that there's a real sense of horror that these legacies are going to be called into question, and the privileges of being white in America. And I see there's similar things that have been going on over the decades. I hope that answers the question.
Christi, thank you so much. That was so fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. I want to let me see if I've got this right. I feel like there's a location, then there is a genre, there is a certain voice, and a kind of pressure that you bring to bear upon modes of reading. But I'm also curious to know, where exactly do you think does that pressure lie? Because I get a feeling that you are calling into question genre making. You are calling into question the idea that an autobiography is not necessarily only an autobiography. or that an essay is not only an essay in some sense, that there are certain attributes we come to associate with certain genres, but really speaking, the voices and you present a range of voices, and especially some really, really situated voices that you bring, like that of Kaushalya Basantri and Kubud Pavade and so on. And what these voices do is to actually show us that there has been that matters of genre are also matters of translation. The translation is not only what actually goes into the text, but it has gone into the making of a particular form, right? I wasn't sure what your alignment or agreement or disagreement with Moretti was, because I wasn't sure what happened in that slide. So if you could sort of articulate that for us, is that, or maybe I didn't read the slide properly, is the argument against individual text, but rather reading texts as archives and in clusters? Is that what Moretti is saying? And where do you stand with that one?
Yeah, the Franco Moretti piece is very complicated. So his piece is against close reading. And so I'm saying it shouldn't be either or. I guess that's kind of everything that I'm saying in this talk. And yes, very much questioning the genres and the assumption that the genres are equivalent. Because I see a lot of, especially graduate students, but even undergraduates and a lot of, my colleagues, we spend a lot of time trying to explain what the genres are that we are reading. And even when we get a name that seems equivalent, there's kind of different protocols, different histories that are going on. I don't see that there's enough of that in general, but especially with nonfiction genres. So that's part of it. And therefore, translation is crucial to it, critical to use that term. And I think that's one of the terms that needs to be brought to bear when you're thinking about distant reading. If you look at how Moretti's been doing his work, he kind of has a plug and play, like, oh, and here's what goes on in Japanese and here. And so in the name of trying to make it even across the globe, he's trying to put everything on the same path. And part of this is a digital humanities question that I'm asking in the background. But I feel like the idea of distant and close, the metaphor is a really good one. Another complaint I have against Moretti is that he got really excited about literature as data, and that you could take social scientific methods and kind of plug them in, and then you see some kind of visualizations. And it seems to me that we miss an opportunity by we need to invent approaches that are specific to the cases that we're looking at in close up, and then take out the medium frame and kind of fine tune the relationship of the close to the distant, not just take it for granted.
If I may ask a follow-up question, Sanchit. So Chris, if I'm looking at, for instance, your work since Riddles of Belonging to now, play has been very important to the way you approach your material. And you cause that play, you effect that play sometimes by mixing voices or displacing the objective third person voice to the first person, introducing new elements in academic writing, which you did way back at a time when people were not doing that in their first monograph. In this present work, I still see that play, but I want to hear from you as to what role does it play here? Where do you see it in modes of reading, or do you see in the fact that while there are certain thematic clusters, but there are really the hybrid mixture and the temporalities is where it seems to be at. If you could kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you again. It's really, you know my work better than I do. I was surprised when I was going through and having, like, going back over these slides, how much Cheyfitz emphasizes play in his reading of Montaigne, that he's being playful there too. And I think there's a way that that Babington 3 is being playful in the way that she's kind of recreating this. By the way, there's an earlier version. The reason she ends up writing her life story is because Urmila Pawar and Meenakshi Moon go and interview her for a book that they write on the history of the Ambedkarite movement. And she thinks, and then Kumar Paude and some other people encourage her to write her life story. So there's that same scene in the short excerpt that that is in the book that Pawar and Moon write. But when she writes out the scene, she's a lot more playful. And I'm getting to the point where I just feel like that is one of the things we need to look at in anything that we consider literary. Kind of look for that play, and it's play in the Dwivedian sense too. That it just, there's some movement there. And Linda Hutchin has a really wonderful book where she talks about kind of irony as being dynamic, and it's that relationship. But it also, it's partially taking on such a heavy topic, is kind of thinking about violence, injustice, these human rights violations, and people are advocating for them. But when you meet Urmila Pawar, she is delightful. She's got a great sense of humor. She brings that to bear. And I have been at more than one occasion where I've been asked to speak about my work. And I'm trying to be playful about it and say that, you know, that oftentimes that is one of the tools that you can use to call into question some of these subject positions. Absolutely. And people are really, oh, you know, you're not supposed to joke about this, you know, and the only way you can have permission to joke about it is if you show that you are part of that persecuted, oppressed group. And I feel like that rule is not going to really help us kind of move to something that's a lot, that really gives space for each of us to consider what we might do in that situation. I use that that quotation from Babington 3 to ask students to think about what they would do if they were there in 1930s colonial India and someone were riding by on a bicycle. What would you do? What would you do if you were the bicyclist? What would you do if that was your mom calling out, you know, and get them to imagine different scenarios. And again, I think of that as playful too. Is that kind of the way you're thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, I'll think more about it, and I would like to actually see the chapter in writing to be able to respond more.
So if we don't have any more questions or comments, I believe we've come to the end of the session. So thank you all for joining us this late in the evening, and thank you, Professor Merrill, for joining us this early in the morning.
And thank you for taking the time, all of you. Really appreciate it.
Chris, all the best with your project, and do let me know how it goes.